If you want to get richer, do not begin by asking how to earn more. Begin by asking what is slowing you down. That is the first thing I would tell you if you and I were sitting across a plain table and speaking honestly instead of ceremonially. Most people spend their whole financial life staring at the income side of the equation as if the answer must always be there. Better job, bigger raise, new client, promotion, bonus, side hustle. More money coming in. They believe wealth is mainly a matter of pushing harder on the engine. Sometimes it is. Very often it is not. Very often the deeper problem is drag. That is the mother line of everything I am going to tell you. Most people are not financially stuck because their engine is too weak. They are stuck because their life is full of drag. Too many accounts, too many choices, too many purchases, too many tabs open in the mind, too much noise around investing, too many things to maintain, too many little leaks in time, attention, and money. Too many obligations disguised as lifestyle. Too many systems built for impulse rather than accumulation. That is what keeps people tired. That is what keeps people reactive. That is what keeps them earning good money and still feeling poor. I know this because I have watched that exact pattern play out in thousands of different forms. A person can earn well and still live inside a financial machine, so cluttered, so friction heavy, and so full of silent drag that the money never has a chance to become freedom. It arrives, gets absorbed by complexity, gets diluted by noise, gets shaved away by careless consumption and misallocated attention, and then disappears into the background of a life that somehow still feels busy, expensive, and unfinished. The public version of this problem sounds too simple, so people ignore it, spend less, simplify, automate, reduce waste, own fewer things, focus. It sounds like the kind of advice printed on the inside of a cheap notebook. People think, surely wealth must be more sophisticated than that. Often it is not. Often wealth begins the moment your life stops fighting itself. I want you to hold one image in your mind while I walk you through this. Picture a racing car on a straight track. Most people think the way to win is to keep building a bigger engine. More horsepower, more fuel, more heat, more output. But imagine that same car dragging chains, carrying old furniture in the trunk, with the handbrake half up, tires underinflated, dashboard lights flashing, extra weight bolted to the roof, and a driver constantly looking sideways at everybody else instead of ahead at the road. That is how most people live with money. Then they wonder why the car feels slow. They think they need more engine. Usually they need less drag. That is what minimalism really means in financial life. Not aesthetic emptiness, not joyless deprivation, not a performance of virtue, not punishing yourself with less for the sake of appearing disciplined. Minimalism, in the only form I have ever found economically interesting, is the removal of drag from a life that is supposed to build wealth. It is clarity operationalized. It is simplification in service of compounding. It is the decision to stop paying energy to things that do not deserve ownership of your future. That is a very different idea from have less stuff. Let us begin where drag usually hides first, not in the stock market, in the architecture of everyday money. This is the first mechanism. I call it account sprawl. People love the feeling of optimization more than they love real control. That is why they collect accounts the way some people collect kitchen gadgets, a bank account for spending. Another for this goal, another because of a sign-up bonus, another because of a slightly better rate, one credit card for points, another for travel, one for balance transfers, another because a friend recommended it. The person feels smart because the system looks elaborate. What he often has built is not a wealth machine. It is administrative fog. Fog is expensive. Fog hides leakage. Fog steals attention. Fog makes the simple act of knowing where you stand harder than it needs to be. I have never been impressed by complexity that does not produce a meaningful advantage. A good system should reduce friction, not increase it. Yet many people create financial lives with so many moving parts that they no longer have a clean picture of what is really happening. Balances are scattered, rules differ, minimums must be met, payments must be remembered. Mental energy gets consumed not by growing wealth, but by managing the machinery of appearing financially sophisticated. That is backward. The purpose of a system is to make clarity cheap. One account for spending, one place for emergency liquidity, one path for investing. Beyond that, every extra layer should justify itself ruthlessly. If it does not produce a real edge, it is probably just drag dressed up as cleverness. This is what people fail to understand about simplification. Simplification is not less serious. It is often more serious. When you remove the unnecessary layers, you make it easier to see the truth. How much is coming in? How much is going out? How much is being invested? How much is actually under control? That matters, because what cannot be seen cleanly rarely gets improved cleanly. The second place drag hides is somewhere even more ordinary. Decision fatigue. This is the second mechanism. I call it the wardrobe tax. People laugh at the idea that clothing choices could have anything to do with wealth. They should not. Financial life is not made only of large decisions. It is made of the cumulative condition of the mind making those decisions. A mind worn down by unnecessary choices becomes more impulsive, less strategic, and more vulnerable to easy spending later in the day. Every trivial decision consumes a little order. What do I wear? Which shoes? What matches? What version of myself am I performing today? How do I look? Do I need something new? Am I behind? Do I need to upgrade? A cluttered wardrobe is rarely only a wardrobe. It is often a small museum of old identities. Impulse purchases, aspirational selves, bad fits, guilty expenses, and constant low-grade decision friction. That is why I have always admired functional simplicity. Not because uniformity is holy, because energy is finite. If the same task returns every morning and drains attention while adding no real value, that task deserves suspicion. A smaller, clearer wardrobe is a financial act in two directions at once. It lowers the future temptation to browse and refresh. It also preserves mental sharpness for choices that actually alter the trajectory of a life. Better still, if the clothing that remains is good enough to last. Quality compounds when replacement slows. This is the deeper lesson. Minimalism is not the worship of less. It is the removal of low-return decisions. The world is filled with people spending premium cognition on discount choices and then wondering why they feel drained before they reach the parts of the day that truly matter. Now let us move to a drag force that destroys more returns than most bad investments ever will. Noise. This is the third mechanism. I call it the opportunity swarm. If you expose an ordinary investor to enough forecasts, hot takes, friends' stock tips, algorithmic video clips, trading groups, newsletters, prediction accounts, top 10 lists, recession alarms, pivot rumors, and miracle opportunities, he will eventually lose the ability to distinguish investing from agitation. He will feel informed while becoming unstable. That is the opportunity swarm. It creates the sensation of being surrounded by chances. What it usually produces is drift. The person opens a long-term investing account and then immediately starts sabotaging it with short-term stimulation. He buys something he half understands because everybody else is buying it. He checks prices too often. He mistakes motion for control. He watches a dip and feels personally addressed. He sells when frightened. He buys when late. He accumulates activity and calls it strategy. This is why I have always preferred a deeply boring approach to wealth over an exciting one. Excitement is almost always trying to recruit your money into a story. The problem is not that every story is false. The problem is that your attention is finite, and every new opportunity asks to be taken seriously before the older compounding plan has been given the long, quiet room it requires. Ordinary wealth is rarely destroyed by one terrible stock. It is more often weakened by a constant swarm of unnecessary opportunities. Ignore 99% of them. That is not laziness. That is filtration. When you own broad productive assets sensibly and keep feeding them over time, the greatest favor you can do for yourself is often not to add brilliance but to subtract interference. That sounds almost insultingly simple, which is one reason it works. People want investing to flatter intelligence. Often it rewards consistency more than cleverness. Most investors do not underperform because they are stupid. They underperform because the opportunity swarm made them restless. The fourth mechanism is more physical, more ordinary, and economically more important than many people admit. I call it quality concentration. There is a false economy in buying cheap versions of things you use constantly. It feels prudent in the moment. It often becomes expensive over time. Not always. I am not romantic about spending, but there are categories where buying badly and buying repeatedly costs more than buying once with seriousness. Shoes you wear every week, a mattress you sleep on every night, a bag that holds daily strain, a tool you use constantly. Kitchen items that determine what home life feels like, a chair your body spends years inside. The cheap version often comes with hidden costs, replacement, dissatisfaction, waste, friction, and the subtle mental drag of constantly living with objects that half fail you. This is why I prefer fewer, better things in categories that truly matter. Not because luxury is a moral virtue, because stability matters. If something is used often enough, then durability becomes a financial principle rather than an aesthetic preference. This is where many people confuse minimalism with deprivation. They think simplification means always choosing the cheapest version. That is the opposite of what I mean. The point is not to own low-quality things while congratulating yourself on restraint. The point is to stop buying in loops. Buy carefully, buy rarely, buy for use, then keep it. That is quality concentration. You concentrate your spending into fewer, better decisions and starve the endless cycle of replacing, upgrading, regretting, and rebuying. There is enormous financial power in becoming someone who is difficult to sell the same category to twice. Now let us move to a more psychological form of drag residual identity. This is the fifth mechanism. I call it the life residue effect. One of the more expensive habits in adult life is continuing to consume for lives you are no longer living. Old hobbies, old aesthetics, old ambitions, old weddings, old renovations, old versions of the self that needed certain brands, certain accounts, certain aspirational references, certain social feeds, certain categories of browsing to feel coherent. Most people do not carry only physical clutter. They carry identity clutter. Their phone keeps showing them things for people they used to be. Their feeds are still full of accounts that stimulate wants which no longer match their actual values. Their shopping patterns are still tethered to seasons of life that have already ended. The emotional residue remains active long after the practical relevance is gone. This matters because attention shapes desire, and desire shapes spending. If you are still consuming visual cues from a self you no longer intend to become, then part of your budget is being quietly recruited by an old script. That is expensive. I think a great many financial problems are actually identity problems, wearing transaction level clothing. People spend because something in them still needs to confirm a version of selfhood that the rest of their life has already outgrown. A cleaner financial life often begins not with a spreadsheet, but with an unfollow button. You do not need to leave the modern world. You do need to stop feeding identities you no longer wish to finance. That is the life residue effect. The past version of you keeps billing the future version of you for services no longer required. Now we arrive at a force that seems almost trivial and is quietly enormous: delayed lifestyle inflation. This is the sixth mechanism. I call it the raise capture rule. The most common financial tragedy among high earners is not that they never make more money. It is that the new money arrives and instantly disappears into a larger life before it has time to become a stronger future. This happens so naturally that people rarely experience it as self-sabotage. It feels like fairness. I worked harder, I moved up. I deserve a little more ease, a little more space, a little more convenience, a little more quality, a little more reward. And one by one the raise is gone. This is why I say wealth is not built mainly by making more. It is built by deciding what happens first when more arrives. If your income rises and your lifestyle rises in near-perfect coordination, you have not materially widened the gap that creates wealth. You have simply made your present more expensive. Capture the raise before you feel it. That is the rule. When compensation increases, most of the increase should be diverted automatically, before your nervous system has time to normalize it as available spending. Put it into investments. Put it into future ownership. Put it into broad, productive assets. Let the old life continue carrying the daily month while the new money begins building the next decade. That is why I think delayed lifestyle inflation is one of the great underappreciated wealth tactics. It is not deprivation, it is sequencing. You are not saying no forever. You are saying not yet because this increment of income must first be recruited into a machine bigger than consumption. Someone earning $80,000 and still living roughly as though he earns $50 can become far wealthier than someone earning $150 and spending $140. The world sees salary and assumes power. I look at captured surplus. That is where power begins. Now we move beyond money into something even scarcer, time. This is the seventh mechanism. I call it schedule ownership. A person who cannot say no does not own his calendar. A person who does not own his calendar rarely owns his future. This is because time behaves much like capital. It can be allocated deliberately or consumed by others with surprising ease. Meetings that did not need to exist. Social obligations accepted from awkwardness, endless coffee chats, favor economies, reactive commitments, low-value errands, digital grazing disguised as staying informed. All of it leaves a person busy enough to feel justified and fragmented enough to remain weak. The financially serious person eventually discovers that time and money are more closely linked than most people imagine. Every unnecessary yes is not only lost time, it is often lost reading, lost reflection, lost rest, lost strategic work, lost skill, building, lost clarity, lost planning, lost patience. Those losses eventually show up in money, even if they begin on the calendar. I have never liked the phrase, time is money, because it is too small. Time is not money. Time is more valuable than money because it can become money. Judgment, relationships, health, wisdom, or peace. Money can only do some of that once it arrives. A person who gives away time cheaply usually ends up giving away more than he realizes. That is why saying no is not merely social courage. It is financial defense. Not every request deserves access to the hours that could be used to build the life you keep. The eighth mechanism brings us back to physical life again, but with a deeper rhythm. I call it seasonal reset. Most people declutter like a person panicking after a room becomes unlivable. They do one dramatic purge, feel temporarily virtuous, and then resume the same acquisition habits that produced the problem. That is not simplification. That is emotional reset theater. A better method is seasonal reset, not only spring cleaning, a recurring confrontation with accumulation itself. Every season, a check on what has entered the home, the closet, the mind, the subscriptions, the digital life, the schedule, the kitchen, the drawers, the unseen storage of postponed decisions. Because clutter is not a single event, it is a system. And systems do not disappear because one afternoon was productive. This is why I think recurring reset matters more than one grand cleansing ritual. The reset interrupts reaccumulation before it becomes invisible. It forces you to see what you keep becoming. It keeps the home from turning into a warehouse of low-quality decisions. More importantly, it changes future buying. Once you have handled the weight of your own unnecessary possessions, honestly enough, shopping becomes harder to romanticize. That is where real simplification starts. Not with the purge, with the reduced desire to refill. Now let us move to the final mechanism, and this one is almost embarrassingly practical. I call it purchase friction. Modern commerce is designed to make the distance between impulse and transaction almost non-existent. One tap, one saved card, one remembered password. One little rectangle on a screen asking nothing of you except momentary surrender. People then scold themselves for lack of willpower as if they are failing some ancient moral test. They are not. They are standing inside a system professionally engineered to reduce friction in one direction only. So add friction back, delete the app, remove the stored card. Make yourself log in again. Make the purchase mildly inconvenient. This sounds too small to matter until you try it. A surprising amount of spending survives only because it can travel from urge to execution before the wiser self has time to arrive. Add 30 seconds, add 1 minute, add a browser instead of an app, add a manual cart entry, add a waiting period. A meaningful number of purchases die simply because the environment no longer rewards impulsive continuation. That is not weakness. That is design. I have always preferred systems that make bad behavior slightly annoying and good behavior slightly automatic. Human beings are easier to guide than to perfect. Once you accept that, you stop waiting to become a noble creature of pure restraint and start building a life in which restraint is structurally easier. That is what purchase friction does. It reintroduces decision into transactions that were previously designed to skip it. Now let me gather the whole machine. Account sprawl clouds judgment and turns money management into fog. The wardrobe tax wastes cognition on low-value choices. The opportunity swarm destabilizes long-term investing. Quality concentration stops replacement loops. The life residue effect keeps old identities billing your future. The raise capture rule prevents income growth from dissolving into lifestyle creep. Schedule ownership protects the hours that build wealth. Seasonal reset stops clutter from quietly recolonizing life. Purchase friction interrupts impulse before it becomes expenditure. That is the architecture of minimalist wealth. Notice what is missing. There is no magical stock, no impossible side hustle, no brilliant hack, no social performance of, I became rich because I discovered something nobody else knows. That is precisely the point. Most people do not need more information. They need less drag. And this is why minimalism can make a person richer almost effortlessly once the real work of system design is done. Not because money appears from nowhere, because the leaks close. The noise recedes. The decisions become cleaner. The gap widens. The money that used to vanish into friction begins surviving long enough to become ownership. That is what richer really means in the long run. Not more stuff, more unclaimed future, more choice, more room, more life that is not already spoken for. If you want a better financial life, do not ask first what new opportunity you should chase. Ask what drag you can remove this week. Simplify the accounts. Reduce the decisions. Ignore most opportunities. Better, stop feeding old identities. Capture the raise. Protect the calendar. Reset the environment. Add friction to the purchase. That is enough to change a decade. The great financial tragedy is that people keep trying to build wealth by adding complexity to lives already overloaded with drag. It is like trying to make a car faster by bolting more engine onto a frame full of rust, loose weight, and hidden braking force. Sometimes the wiser path is not to add, it is to remove. That is what I would want you to remember. Not that minimalism is noble, not that consumption is wicked, not that there is virtue in empty rooms or neutral sweaters or saying no to everything fun. I am not interested in moral theater. I am interested in clean systems. And the clean system says this: if your life costs less attention to maintain, less money to feed, and less ego to perform, then more of your income can turn into ownership. More of your attention can turn into judgment, and more of your years can turn into freedom. That is what being rich eventually means, not applause. Less drag. Once you understand that, a great many purchases stop looking exciting, and a great many simplifications start looking like hidden forms of wealth. That is the upgrade, not to a prettier life, to a cleaner machine. And if I had to reduce the whole lesson to one sentence, I would say you do not get rich only by pushing harder on the engine. You get rich when you remove enough drag that the engine you already have can finally start building real speed.